Sexuality is as old as humanity itself. As long as we've been attracted to other people, there's been sexuality. But who you're attracted to doesn't really translate well into archaeological evidence, and so we have to turn to other sources to discover how easy it was to be gay the Viking way. And you may not know this, but the writer of this episode, Susie, actually did Viking studies at university and did her entire dissertation on Viking sexuality, and so she was over the moon to see this topic come up. And now on to the history. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Sexuality in context. Vikings seem to be the absolute pinnacle of male virility, especially with how they've been portrayed by other cultures and in modern media. Known for their ferocity and willingness to rape, it's hard to imagine how Viking society would have treated queer people. Sexuality in the Viking Age is a fascinating topic that has been studied for years, but it's difficult to get to the heart of the matter. Original sources like the sagas or legal documentation don't tell the whole story as they've fragmented over time, and often date to a much later time period. One of the key things when looking at homosexuality in the Viking period is to understand the world that the Vikings were living in and how their society viewed that world. One way of doing this is to look at cultures that either shared similar belief systems or were analogous in other ways, like simply existing in a similar time period. The Celts are often used as a point of comparison to the Vikings, as they both had strong warrior classes and were similar in terms of their beliefs and social strata. While we have some accounts of same-sex relationships in Celtic times, we don't really know how these relationships were accepted in wider society, and so we run into the same problem as with gay Vikings. An earlier culture might give us a better understanding of how Vikings viewed homosexuality, and that's the Romans. Roman culture didn't exactly accept or reject homosexuality, but their attitude towards it was deeply rooted in ideas of social status and whether you were an active or passive partner, similar to the Vikings. There's not much archaeological evidence that we can point to that proves cultural attitudes towards homosexuality, and so we have to take what we can from the sagas. There are mentions of same-sex acts in the sagas, but the focus is once again on the social role and reputation of the people involved. A matter of honor. Viking society was founded upon concepts of honor, reputation, social structure, and a bone-deep understanding of where you fit in. You lived your life knowing where you stood in your community and knew that every behavior and every act would have an impact on your reputation. Therefore, your sexuality and choice of partner also played a significant role in how you were perceived and what that meant for you and your family. It was vital for a Viking man to be seen as a man of honor. That meant being brave and dominant, not somebody who could be pushed around by others. Gender roles in society were strictly adhered to, at least that's what the text seemed to imply, and different spheres of life belonged to either the man or the woman. This extended to the bedroom too. Effectively, gender roles were upheld during sex. One partner was the active giver, and the other was the passive recipient. No prizes as to which was the man's role. A man who was too passive, or a woman who was too aggressive, would face social ostracization, as they would be seen to be stepping out the boundaries of normal sexual behavior. The terms for a man who wasn't manly enough in his sexual relationships were aga or raga, essentially slurs that implied you had lost honor and masculinity. It's important to remember that these terms and attitudes don't reflect directly into the modern day. Viking society was very different to ours, and these terms tell us more about societal expectations of the time than anything about the person being labelled as Argo. All of this leads to a complicated doublethink moment. In a homosexual relationship, there would still be the two roles where one person assumes the masculine role and the other would have the feminine role. The masculine partner would not necessarily have been stigmatized for being in a gay relationship because he was still performing in a masculine way, but the passive partner would have been ridiculed because he was seen to be taking on a feminine role that wasn't appropriate for a man in the Viking Age. Gay gods and heroes. What would a video about Viking sexuality be without at least a passing mention of the trickster god Loki? In the Disney show, Loki has been confirmed canonically to be bisexual, even if there isn't that much representation of that orientation on screen. But is that a true representation of Loki? The sagas paint a much more colourful character, with Loki frequently flirting with the boundaries of propriety for Viking men and regularly changing shape and sex, even giving birth to an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir at one point, meaning that he was definitely the passive partner in that particular sexual encounter. Loki is a difficult character to pin down. He's neither a god nor a giant, and so sits slightly outside the Viking social structure. Because of his background and not fitting into Viking society, it's possible that Loki can take on feminine roles and won't lose honor, as he doesn't have any to begin with. If you're not part of the social structure, you can't really be stigmatized for not behaving in the right way. What isn't clear from the sagas is how Loki perceives himself. We don't know if he's homosexual, bisexual, gender fluid, or anything else. Loki can shapeshift, and so he can appear in any form he wants, whether that's male, female, or even an animal, as demonstrated in the Gylfaginning part of the Prose Edda. His ability to change shape doesn't seem to be because he wants to be a woman, rather that it's important to whatever his current plan needs. Loki is almost always portrayed as a man and is referred to with masculine pronouns, he and him. Even so, Loki's penchant for playing with gender norms lets us see what Viking society would have understood in terms of sexuality and normalcy. If Loki embodies the other or the deviant, then we can assume that the opposite would be the generally accepted norm. However, Loki isn't the only god who engages in transgressive behavior. Odin and Thor both have their moments of unmanliness. Odin, the All-Father and king of the Norse gods, regularly practiced the feminine magic of Sior, which he learned from Freyr. For any other Viking man, this would have immediately meant dishonor and accusations of ergi. Odin is accused of being ergi, but it doesn't seem to impact his honor any further than that. For Thor, it's part of a larger story where the giants have stolen his hammer and he needs it back. As part of the plot, Thor has to disguise himself as the goddess Freyr, but he is very reluctant and complains about having to show such femininity by dressing as a woman. Loki convinces him to do it because he says that it would be even more shameful if the giants could invade Asgard because Thor had lost his hammer, and so Thor finally accepts that he has to dress as a woman. And one final hero who was able to have sex with anything that moved without any sort of stigma was a hero known as Grettir. Whether this is Grettir the Strong or not is unsure, but at the very least the story survives. In the poem Grettirfisla, Grettir is said to have sex with, quote, maidens and widows, everyone's wives, farmers' sons, deans and courtiers, abbots and abbesses, cows and calves, indeed with near all living creatures. And yet somehow he got away with it. Grettir is unusual among Viking heroes, as many of them would still have to stick to the expected gender roles and traits, but because Grettir was the active partner in all of his sexual encounters, he can't be accused of njol. Instead of being a source of shame, Grettir's rampant sex drive serves as a testament to his virility and manhood. Each of these instances shows that Vikings were aware of queerness and other sexualities, at least in their stories. Whether this translated into an understanding or acceptance of homosexuality in everyday life is far from clear. The interesting thing is to see who these characters are. Thor and Odin are both important players in the Norse pantheon, and both are known for their masculinity. Odin is literally called the All-Father, and Thor is known for his feats of strength and bravery. Does this mean that only the men who were most secure in their manhood could exhibit gay traits? What about the women? It seems that early Christian monks were a little squeamish about the idea of lesbianism and just never spoke about it, so we don't have much written evidence about lesbians in the Viking Age. And oddly enough, neither do any of the original Norse texts. It's hard to gauge whether this is because it didn't happen, which is unlikely, wasn't considered a problem, which is also unlikely, or just didn't make it into the history books. An Icelandic law from the 12th century gives an indication that lesbianism was considered an issue that perturbed at least some of the clergy, as Bishop Polak Polason declared that, quote, if women satisfy each other, shall be ordered the same penance as men who perform the most hideous adultery between them or with a quadruped. Yeah, fighting words, clearly. In Old Norse, the word aga is used to describe a man who is unmanly and has lost his honor. The feminine version of this is org, but it doesn't have the same connotations of homosexuality. When a woman is described as being org, it normally means that she's too manly or immodest. The Icelandic Grey Goose laws forbid women from wearing men's clothes or cutting their hair like a man, but there's no hint that this is related to lesbianism. All of that being said, there's the possibility that lesbianism was happening and nobody really paid any attention to it. In Viking Age Iceland, there was a lack of women of childbearing age due to the horrific practice of leaving female babies out in the cold to die. That meant that men wanting to have children would often have a wife, but may also use his thralls as concubines, which was generally accepted as they were of a lower social status and therefore wouldn't impact his wife's honor. This is complete conjecture, but it's possible that co-wives would have formed close bonds, as they all had to live and work in one household. In other societies where a man has multiple wives, there can be lesbian activity as women turn to each other for emotional and sexual support. If that were the case, there wouldn't be much that the husband could do, as it was very easy for a wife to ask for a divorce. This might mean that lesbian relationships were sort of an open secret that never got openly admitted to in the Viking era. Being gay the Viking way. As with all things to do with Vikings, everything comes with a pinch of salt. The Christianization of the original material might mean that we're looking through the lens of Christian morality. That might mean that we're seeing homosexuality being viewed far more negatively because of that Christian lens, and we simply don't have the evidence to show that homosexuality was accepted or not. It's also too simple to say either that Vikings were gay or were generally homophobic. Their culture is completely different to ours, and so we always have to take everything in context. While being gay is often seen as part of your identity in modern culture, Viking identity is formed from your family ties, your honor, and the way you act, not who you have sex with. And the same applies to homophobia. From what we can tell in the Viking era, it wasn't so cut and dried. Not all homosexual acts were stigmatized, and homosexuality was only viewed negatively because it was associated with being too feminine. So is it possible to be gay the Viking way? Not really, because it is, as always, more complicated than that. Thank you for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a fantastic week. Cheers!